Hi everyone! This week we're going to talk about the first half of the Middle Kingdom, which consists of the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th dynasties. Some scholars call this the period of reunification after the chaos of the First Intermediate period. It lasted from approximately 2050 to 1710 BCE. So let's get started. As we talked about last week, Pharaoh Mentuhotep II reunified Egypt by defeating the 9th and 10th dynasty kings from Heracleopolis. Following this reunification, Mentuhotep was considered by his subjects divine, or at least half divine. This belief carried on for about 200 years into the late 12th dynasty. Throughout his reign, Mentuhotep II launched multiple military campaigns into Nubia and the Near East. To control the power of the local Nomarchs, which rose in the First Intermediate period, Mentuhotep II installed governors of Lower and Upper Egypt. Mentuhotep II also started multiple building projects during his reign. The most preserved and probably most important was his mortuary temple. This is the earliest mortuary temple where the king was not just the recipient of the offerings, but he also enacted the ceremonies with the different deities, in this case Amun-Re. The temple also identifies the king with Osiris, who becomes a very important deity during this period. The majority of the temple decoration was created by Theban artists. In general, Theban artists depict thinner figures with larger lips and eyes. Other chapels of Mentuhotep II outside of Thebes were most likely decorated by Memphite artists, who were still influenced by the Old Kingdom style. His mortuary temple is located up against the cliff in Deir el-Bahri, which is across the Nile from Thebes. This site aligned itself with the Temple of Karnak on the other side of the river. It is also located next to the mortuary chapels of New Kingdom pharaohs Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. This site was completely covered with debris until 1859. The complex had two temples, a main temple and a valley temple, which were both linked by a 1.2 kilometer uncovered causeway. There was a large courtyard in front of the main temple, with rectangular flower beds and 55 sycamore trees. This is one of the few archaeologically documented temple gardens. Left and right of the processional walkway, there was at least 22 seated statues of Mentuhotep II. The statues on the south side are wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, while the statues on the north side are wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. These were probably added to celebrate his Hebsed festival. The main temple consisted of two parts. The front part was dedicated to Mentuhotep, who was a combination of the Theban god of war, Mentu, and the sun god Re. A ramp then led to the upper terrace of the temple. On either side of the ramp, there were two porticos with double rows of rectangular pillars, which made the temple look like a Saf tomb, which we talked about last week. On the terrace, there was the core building and an upper hall surrounded by an ambulatory, which is a covered passage. There are three main reconstructions of the superstructure of this temple, which was not preserved. There was either a small pyramid in the middle, a flat roof, or a box filled with earth to create a primordial mound. Behind the core building was the center of the cult of the deified king. It was cut directly into the cliffside, consisting of an open courtyard, a pillared hall with 82 octagonal columns, and a chapel for the statue of the king. This part of the temple was dedicated to Amun-Re. The mortuary temple also consisted of a royal tomb for Mentuhotep II. It was located under a courtyard in the rear part of the temple, down a long, straight corridor. The chamber was entirely lined in red granite and had a pointed roof. It also contained an alabaster chapel, which had a double door. The tomb was plundered in antiquity, but a scepter, arrows, and a collection of models, including ships, granaries, and bakeries, remained. This statue of Mentuhotep II was discovered by Howard Carter and is currently in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. He is seen here wearing a Hebsed cloak, and the statue was actually wrapped in linen before being buried. The black skin and the wrapping indicate that Mentuhotep II was being buried as the god Osiris. The next pharaoh of the 11th dynasty is Mentuhotep III, who most likely was the son of Mentuhotep II. He reigned for about 12 years after his father died. During his reign, he completed an expedition to Punt, as well as several architectural innovations. This expedition left from the city of Koptos and traveled through Wadi Hammamat, which is a dry riverbed that runs from the city to the Red Sea. They apparently brought 3,000 men and built 12 wells along the wadi for future expeditions. They returned from Punt with incense, gum, and perfumes, as well as quarried stone from Wadi Hammamat. Mentuhotep III also built a series of forts in the eastern Delta region to protect Egypt from threats from Asia. He did begin to build his own mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, but it was never completed. It was located close to his father's temple and would have had a causeway. Inscriptions show that the king was most likely buried in a chamber cut in the rock face. He may be the father or brother of the next king, Mentuhotep IV, but this is still being debated. Mentuhotep IV is the last king of the 11th dynasty, although he is not recorded in the Turin Canon Papyrus or the Abydos King List. He is known from a few inscriptions in the Sinai Peninsula and Wadi Hammamat, which record his expedition to the Red Sea. It is assumed by Egyptologists that Mentuhotep IV either died childless or was usurped. Either way, Amenemhat I was the first king of the 12th dynasty. It is also assumed that he is the Amenemhat that was once mentioned as Mentuhotep IV's vizier. It is again unclear if Amenemhat I inherited the throne, ruled in a co-regency with Mentuhotep IV, or killed/usurped the throne from him. It is known that he is not from a royal lineage, as his father, Senusret, was a local nomarch. He did move the capital of the country from Thebes to an ancient city called Ijawi. The exact location of the royal city is not yet known, but it was likely in the Fayum region in Lower Egypt, close to El-Lisht, where cemeteries are located from this period. In an interesting turn of events, Amenemhat I built a pyramid complex for his final resting place, in the style of the 5th and 6th dynasty kings. It is located in the city of El-Lisht and is made up of blocks of limestone and rubble before being covered in white Tura limestone casing. Interestingly, the rubble contained fragments of decorated blocks from Old Kingdom monuments such as Khufu and Khafre's pyramid complexes. Like the older pyramids, when the limestone casing was removed, the interior of the pyramid slumped. A slope shaft blocked with granite plugs led to a burial chamber. Unfortunately, because this pyramid was built closer to the Nile than previous pyramids, the burial chamber and passageways have been flooded by groundwater. There are two Egyptian literary works that might give us a picture of how Amenemhet I died. The Instructions of Amenemhet is a text where a deceased king gives his son advice during a dream. He tells him that he was assassinated by his own guards in his sleep, while his son was campaigning in Libya. This account of events is also given in the story of Senusret, another literary text. Of course, this could just be a fictionalized account of his death to strengthen Senusret I's role as king. Amenemhet I may have had a possible co-regency with his son at least 10 years before his possible assassination. Before we move on to the next pharaoh, I just wanted to cover one non-royal named Meketre. He was chancellor and high steward during the reigns of Mentuhotep II, Mentuhotep III, and Amenemhet I. His tomb is located in Sheikh Abed al-Qurna, which is a cemetery next to Deir el-Bahri. His tomb contained 25 preserved models, half of which depict boats, and the other half depict daily life scenes. This even included a miniature model of his house, with a columned portico and a cattle census taking place in the courtyard. Wooden sculptures of women carrying wine jars and ducks, which are personification of bringing offerings, were also found in the tomb. The Egyptians believed that these models would perform various functions to the deceased in the afterlife. The next king of the 12th dynasty was Senusret I. Just so you know, any pharaoh named Senusret may also be known as Sesostris or Senwosret. He was one of the most powerful pharaohs throughout this period. He continued expanding into Nubia and also established Egypt's formal southern border at the Second Cataract. In Egyptological terms, a cataract is an area where boat travel becomes difficult or even impossible because of shallow waters and rapids. He also organized an expedition to the oasis in the western desert and established diplomatic relations with the rulers of Syria and Cana. Senusret I was able to have several quarrying expeditions, which helped him build several large structures throughout his kingdom. He rebuilt a temple of Amun-Re in Heliopolis, which was the center of the sun cult, along with building 2 red granite obelisks for his Hebsed festival. A temple to Min in Coptos, a temple of Satet in Elephantine, a temple of Montu in Armant, and a temple of Montu in El Tod were just some of his accomplishments. Finally, he built a shrine in Karnak, known as the White Chapel or the Jubilee Chapel. This was built in high-quality limestone for his Hebsed festival. This was disassembled in antiquity, but has recently been reconstructed by the remaining stones. Senusret I built a pyramid complex in El-Lisht, south of his father's complex. This was much larger than his father's complex, although it is currently in ruin and the burial chamber is also underwater. A similar plan was used, but the architects used a new technique. They built outwards from a core of limestone blocks, mud brick, and debris. Then they riveted a central structure for the pyramid, before covering it in the white Tura casing stones. There was an unroofed causeway, which was punctured with alcoves for the statues of the king. This was also flanked by mud brick buildings for the priests who used to perform rituals for the deceased. A small chapel by the front of the pyramid was also found, but this is different from the mortuary chapel attached to the causeway. The central passage within the pyramid led to a burial chamber, which had sculpted lion heads which would spout water. Toward the end of Senusret I's life, he may have appointed his son Amenemhat II as his co-regent. Although he ruled for about 35 years, Amenemhat II's rule is relatively unknown. Many royal women were buried near his pyramid complex, but their relationships to the king are not clear. The most important record from his reign is called the Annals of Amenemhat II and was found in Memphis. This provides records of donations to the temples and some political events. He seems to have led a military expedition to Asia, destroying two cities known as Iui and Iuasi, whose location is still unknown. The Great Sphinx of Tanis, which is located at the Louvre, was probably built by Amenemhat II, but was usurped by later pharaohs. His tomb is known as the White Pyramid, and it is located in Dahshur, which is south of Cairo. Like most pyramids of this period, it now lies in ruin. The complex was surrounded by a large enclosure wall, where several of his presumed family members were buried within. 3 of his daughters' tombs were found untouched, and their surviving jewelry is exquisite. The pyramid has not been fully excavated, so we only have a rough idea of what it looked like. The entrance to the pyramid seemed to be covered by a northern chapel. The burial chamber was fitted with a false gabled ceiling composed of large limestone slabs. A quartzite sarcophagus was set into the floor, and 4 niches were found in the walls of the chamber. There was also a secondary shaft that led to a pit, which could have held the canopic chest of Amenemhet II. The mortuary temple was also located at the east side, but it is almost entirely ruined. Although it is not explicitly stated anywhere, his son and heir was most likely Senusret II, who he shared a brief co-regency with. This is the only co-regency from the Middle Kingdom that has been confirmed. Finally, I wanted to mention the famous Nomarchs under Amenemhet II and their tombs. Some of these governors and nomarchs were buried in rock-cut tombs in Beni Hasan, which is south of modern-day Minya. These 39 tombs are all built and decorated in a similar fashion. They had open courtyards with a hallway that led to interior rooms with columns. These columns were actually not freestanding, but were carved directly into the rock. A small chamber at the back would have been made for the statue of the deceased. The walls were also vividly painted with scenes depicting the deceased, his family, and activities in the afterlife. One of these nomarchs is Khnumhotep II. His tomb is one of the most preserved and beautiful. In the main chamber there is a biography, along with 2 scenes of him hunting birds with a boomerang and spearing fish. Through these images he is controlling the chaos of the animal world with these archaic weapons. There is also a very important image of foreigners visiting Egypt. They are called the Amau group and are interpreted as Asiatic nomadic traders. This group is most often interpreted as the forerunners of the Hyksos people, especially because the man leading the crowd is labeled as a Hyksos. The Hyksos people were an invading group that came during the Second Intermediate Period. Next lecture we're going to cover Amenemhet II's son, Senusret II, and the rest of the 12th dynasty. Thanks, and stay safe.